Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation regarding the Cottage Code Development Project in Shoreline. My name is Caitlin Hepworth and I'm a planning consultant from Blue Line. I've been working with Elise Kim with the City of Shoreline on developing a code to support the development of cottage housing in the city. A virtual open house occurred on October 5th, 2022, and this video is a summary of the project and the presentation that happened at the virtual open house. If you have any ideas or thoughts about the project, I really encourage you to reach out to the City of Shoreline to submit your feedback. So this presentation is divided into three main sections. The first section is the introduction. We will be describing what Shoreline's doing to plan for housing and what is required by the state when we plan for housing. The second part is a project overview. We will answer the question, why are we doing this project and what is the city's ultimate goal? And then finally, I will be giving a brief presentation on what cottage housing is and what factors are being considered in developing the new code. So our goal today is to discuss cottage housing regulations and what they might look like in the city of Shoreline, with a focus of elements that the city should consider on integrating cottage housing into the existing community successfully. The open house presentation is intended to provide an educational component and clarify some of the language we use to describe cottage housing. We want to bring everybody up to speed on what the state level requirements are to plan for housing, how the city has been planning for housing so far, and we also want to ensure that everyone understands what cottage housing really is. Through this educational component, Shoreline will clarify the purpose of the project and what we are aiming to accomplish from the project. We will also be discussing the placement and design of cottage housing and code considerations that the city typically makes when developing a new housing code. Most importantly, the purpose of this presentation is to also build some consensus on the project. We want to optimize the opportunities for the code to succeed and encourage alternative housing types to be developed within the community. Overall, the community needs to affirm the intention of the project to provide a greater diversity of housing in the city to provide more opportunities for affordable housing to residents. Shoreline would like to note that they would like to maintain the existing city neighborhoods while trying to diversify the types of housing built in these neighborhoods. And with that, I would like to begin going over what the legal requirements are to plan for housing in Washington and what Shoreline has done so far. So in Washington state, all cities are required within King County to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of their operations, facilities, and services to ensure that the city's system is properly prepared for population growth. The summary of this analysis is compiled into what we like to call a comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is typically required every 8 years, but after 2024 will be required every 10 years. And this plan must plan for the population growth over the next 20 years. The comprehensive plan always includes a housing element chapter to describe how the city has capacity for growth. As shown on the screen, the city has a housing growth target of 13,330 units to plan for in 2044. Currently, the city has in its stock, as of 2018, 23,702 units. The overall number of housing units that we are targeting for 2044, that is the existing and the target new dwelling units, is a cumulative total of 37,032 dwelling units. In 2021, House Bill 1220 was passed by the Washington legislature, which increased the planning requirements for housing under the comprehensive plan. Let's take a look at what those are. So under House Bill 1220, cities that plan for housing are required to accommodate housing for every economic segment of the community. This means that every economic level that exists within a community needs to have housing that's planned for that economic level proportionally. This directly impacts land use planning of Washington communities. The comprehensive plan that directs present and future decisions regarding physical, social, and economic development. House Bill 1220 was required to reduce some political pressure at the local level and to encourage the diversification of housing types and decriminalize other housing types. Income bands are typically defined by area median income and are used to identify what kind of socioeconomic needs a city's community might have. Think of area median income like this. If the lowest income in the city is on one side of a spectrum and the highest income is on the other side, the number in the exact middle would be considered the median income for the city. Housing is needed in the region, but housing of all affordability levels is considered it needs to be considered instead of allocating only one type of housing to meet population growth requirements. In the past, some cities have planned for only apartments or single family housing to meet housing needs, but these are two types of housing that are on opposite ends of the same spectrum. This can lead to displacement, or when a household that was able to afford to live in a city no longer can afford to live there because there's a lack of affordability. Think of it like this. You are a newly empty nest household and are looking to downsize your home in Shoreline because you're ready for retirement and you don't have as much need for a bigger house with more rooms and space than you used to. However, you're having a hard time finding an housing option that you can afford and meets your needs. This would cause you to sell your home and consider moving elsewhere. Another key piece of housing legislation in Washington that helps facilitate our discussion today is House Bill 1923. This passed in 2019 by the Washington legislature and encouraged cities to increase their capacity for residential units by providing grant money to help study housing needs. Shoreline applied for the grant program and won in November 2019 to complete a housing action plan and better understand what the community's needs were for housing, understand what the existing housing stock looks like, and to create a toolkit of what possible actions the city should consider to improve housing opportunities, variety, and affordability. As shown on the screen, this is an excellent example of what the housing spectrum looks like. As you can see, single family homes are on one side of the spectrum because they take up the most amount of land to develop, but often have the lowest number of people per square mile or per acre. On the other side of the spectrum, you see a mid-rise apartment, which requires less space but holds more people compactly and can sometimes have retail available on the ground floor. So as I mentioned, Shoreline won the housing grant and spent 2020 through 2021 developing their housing action plan. The housing action plan summarizes statistically valid data to describe demographics, including employment, housing, and affordability within the city. The plan examines the existing conditions. However, it also considers what housing needs will need to be available in 2044 with the anticipated population growth. Existing policies and codes were evaluated during the Housing Action Plan process to see if there were roadblocks to developing different kinds or forms of housing that could create more diversity and affordability in the city. So, what were some of the key takeaways from this Housing Action Plan, you might be asking? And I'm here to present on those results. So some of the key findings of the Housing Action Plan are going to be presented on the next couple slides. The supply of available housing in Shoreline has gone down, and the sales price has increased consistently between 2012 and 2020. The average price of a median priced housing unit in Shoreline in 2020 was $620,000, which is a 288% increase from the 2012 average of $215,000. This indicates certain housing types may be getting less affordable than they historically were, and people that could once afford them no longer can. Cost burdens are felt at every economic level in the city, but are typically impacting a greater percentage of economic segments in the community earning less than 80% of the, or sorry, earning 80% or less of the area median income. Affordability can be a problem for you at almost any level in the city of Shoreline. As you can see on this slide, there's a vast majority of single-family housing in the city, as it comprises 66% of the housing stock, or approximately 16,462 units. Apartments or multifamily units are then the second most prevalent type of housing in the city. As of 2019, there were only about 73 units of other types of housing. This ranges from duplexes, fourplexes, uh, and triplexes. Shoreline has a lack of housing diversity overall, and the legislative requirements are asking the city to consider how to create more housing, uh, more variety of housing types in the city so that we can create more opportunities for affordability. So why is the city examining cottage housing? And how did we get from the Housing Action Plan to developing a cottage code? So based on the data results from the Housing Action Plan, a toolkit was also prepared to describe what kinds of potential policy actions the city should consider to alleviate some of the housing gaps and stressors that are in the city. The Housing Action Plan recommendations can be summarized with two primary recommendations. The first is to create a greater variety of housing choices for residents. The second was to encourage housing types that are more affordable than the standard 3 to 4 bedroom single family home. Cottages are seen as an excellent tool to cultivate more affordability. They tend to be smaller and clustered in groups, which reduces the amount of space needed to develop them and increases the amount of density on the site. This in turn can reduce costs associated with building out the site and the house, and these savings could be passed on to home buyers. So you may be wondering if a cottage is the same as a detached accessory dwelling unit, also known as a dadu. Cottages and dadus have some similar characteristics, but are different. For those of you who don't know, a dadu is a detached residential accessory structure that is secondary to a single family home and can be built on the same lot as a single family home. Homeowners can use their properties to develop a single rental unit and generate income by renting it out. This is what a dadu represents. It is secondary to the single family home, must be smaller, and rented only. In Shoreline, only one dadu is allowed per residence if there is sufficient space on the site for it. Cottages, on the other hand, are independently owned homes. Cottage owners share a collective piece of land with other cottage owners and share responsibility for maintaining it. This can be done through an HOA. So now that everyone is up to speed on the whys of the project, I want to outline where we are in the cottage housing code development process. After the adoption of the Housing Action Plan in May 2021, the City Council determined that cottage housing would be an excellent first policy action to address. Blue Line prepared an existing conditions report in spring of 2022, evaluating the shoreline residential landscape, reviewing the past cottage housing code and subsequent actions, and evaluating case studies of other cities that have successfully adopted and implemented a cottage housing code. Now that we are in the public engagement phase of the cottage housing project, um, we have been finishing up working through the community survey, which asked residents to provide feedback on concerns, priorities, and their desired aesthetic for cottage housing. We also asked cottage residents to complete a survey asking for feedback from one of the existing 7 cottage developments in Shoreline on how they were designed and if they felt like they were operating and functioning correctly. We also had a stakeholder meeting with people that worked on residential projects in Shoreline in the past and may have a technical understanding of the land use code, permit process, and market conditions. Finally, we had the open house event on October 5th, which wrapped up the engagement process. Blue Line is currently in the process of preparing a public engagement summary summarizing the results from all public engagement efforts that have occurred between July and October of 2022. After engagement ends, we will be looking to draft the cottage housing code and we'll be working with the city to get the code adopted by next spring or June of 2023. The draft code will be available for public feedback in Planning Commission and City Council hearings starting most likely in March of 2023. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into what exactly cottage housing is. So what is cottage housing? Cottage housing is defined as a group of small detached structures arranged around a shared court or open space that is visible from the street. These structures tend to be 1 to 1.5 stories and tend to be defined by the shared property ownership idea. So what are some of the key features of cottage housing? So cottage housing units are smaller than a single family unit and tend to be anywhere from 700 to 1,300 square feet and can be 1 or 1.5 stories in height. Aesthetically, they are designed very similarly to single family homes. Typically, on a 1 acre property, there would be 7 to 12 cottage units surrounding a common open space. And then there would be a consolidated parking area as well that would be at the front of the site along the street. So you may have thought cottages are not a new topic in Shoreline. As mentioned, there are currently 7 existing cottage developments in the city. This is because Shoreline used to have a cottage code in place, legalizing this form of housing in the city. As you can see on this slide, I'm going to show and describe the timeline of the past cottage code and what happened previously. So in 1998, the city adopted a comprehensive plan, and the Housing Elemental Chapter identified cottage housing as a policy for implementing um, housing, new housing units to meet future demand of population and housing unit needs. Between 2000, in 2000, the first cottage code is adopted by the city. Between 2002 and 2003, 3 cottage units are developed. However, members of the public submit complaints to the operation about the operation and design of some of these cottage units, triggering the city to reevaluate the cottage code. In March of 2003, the code is revised and has additional requirements in place to mitigate some of the community concerns that were raised previously. Between 2003 and 2004, more cottage housing developments are created and more complaints are received by the public. The city took a step back and put a moratorium on cottage projects until a proper solution could be found. Between 2005 and 2006, the city held a series of public meetings that were intended to identify how to resolve community concerns surrounding cottage housing. The city council ultimately determined that the cottage code needed to be repealed entirely and that the topic would need to be reevaluated down the line in the future under a new code entirely. Since 2006, cottage housing has been completely illegal to develop within the city's limits, although these 7 existing developments are permitted to continue to exist but cannot expand. So shown on this slide are some of the general complaints that were received on cottage developments between 2002 and 2006. These are generally what the community's concerns were. The most common feedback was received on visual appearance and parking lots. Members of the community did not believe that enough parking was being provided and was cluttering the public right of way with more on-street parking in the vicinity, burdening other adjacent property owners that were utilizing public street parking. Another common complaint was appearance. People also believed that not enough consideration was taken into ensuring that cottages were visually compatible with surrounding neighborhoods. Residents stated that the units felt too modular and did not reflect the architecture of the neighborhoods. Shoreline is taking into consideration where it would make the most sense to place future cottage developments within the city. Over the next slide, I'm going to explore how that is being done and what the city sees as a priority for placing cottages. There are two high priorities for cottage placement that the city is considering. This is proximity to amenities and to transit. Intended users of cottages are anticipated to have a lower income than a single family homeowner would. Housing tends to be the highest bill each month for residents, the second largest bill tending to be transportation costs. As a result, cottages should be placed in amenity and transit-rich areas to reduce the demands on roadway infrastructure, reduce greenhouse gases, but also enhance the affordability component of these units for families that may have a lower income. Key amenities considered were commercialized areas, areas with government services, and parks and trails. Key transit routes that were looked at by the city include Sound Transit, Metro Transit, future light rail stations, sidewalks and trails, and bike routes. Shown above is a map created by Blue Line. The map colors indicate the general land use types under the general land use types that are present on these parcels and shows what residential areas are near amenity-rich areas. Additionally, transit routes and sidewalks were included on the map to create a holistic idea um, of what areas of the city would make the most sense to place cottage housing. Cottages should be placed in areas that are rich of amenities and transit. And this map is going to be used to help identify which areas are going to be most appropriate for medium density residential housing. Beyond location, the city is also considering what design and site layout features should look like to maximize efficiency and address public concerns. The city wants to ensure that future medium density housing is compatible and fits into our existing neighborhoods. In architecture, cottages should reflect the design elements of adjacent housing units and maintain the neighborhood character. In scale, cottages should not stick out and should have a pedestrian scale similar to traditional subdivisions. Cottages still need to maintain their defining features like sharing parking and public open spaces to stay affordable. Discussion on what cottages should look like will be our primary discussion point for today. And I will be getting more into the technical language around how we describe design. Over the next few slides, I will be doing this breakdown of key design features and terms that the city traditionally evaluates when it comes to housing. Square footage. So square footage is defined as the floor area enclosed within a building. For cottage housing, this typically tends to be 700 to 1,300 square feet for a cottage housing unit. At most, cottage housing units should be 1.5 stories or about 18 feet in height. Number of units is a term, sorry, density refers to the number of housing units covering an acre of land. For the purpose of this presentation, we're simplifying this topic to how many units should be in a single development. Typically, there are 7 to 12 cottage units on a 1 acre property. The number of units that a development can have will ultimately depend on how much green space is going to be required and how much space is going to be needed for other shared amenities like parking or sidewalks. A setback refers to the distance between buildings on the same property or a building to the end of the property line or the right of way. Typically, cottages are built farther away from the street to accommodate parking near the street. Um, Buildings on cottage properties are also built closer together and are usually 5 to 10 feet apart from one another. Buildings also must be located about 10 feet away from shared property lines. The goal is not to clutter the site or adjacent property owners. So parking requirements are also a factor when it comes to describing and evaluating the design of a residential project. Parking stalls are required for the overall development, and they're determined by the number of bedrooms in each household. Typically, there are 1 to 2 stalls required per housing unit, which are intended to meet residential and guest parking needs. Parking for cottages tends to be in a combined or shared area. Cottage users do not have garages or driveways that are typical for a single family home. The shared parking lot is usually located either in the front, rear, or around the perimeter of the housing units. End user cost and affordability. Ultimately, the city's goal is to create more affordable housing options to ensure that the end user cost is reflective of the project's ultimate intention. Many things can contribute to cost, like materials, permitting, construction timing, and the market. One aspect the city can control relating to affordability is the costs associated with the permitting process. A longer permit process requires more input from the city and a developer's consultants, which adds to cost. Public hearings can also add to costs. Landscaping is another critical component when it comes to residential design, and landscaping is required for almost any kind of project within the city. Landscaping is typically required around the perimeter of properties to buffer between uses and property owners. Usually 5 to 10 feet is required between a cottage unit or cottage development and adjacent properties. Typically, there's also a common open space in cottage developments where owners share access to a collective outdoor space instead of having a personal yard. The open space can have amenities, which will have a walkway around the space. This is typically calculated by requiring a certain square footage of open space for every housing unit that is developed. And finally, building design. How do we want the external appearance of the cottage housing units to look like? Typical elements that are considered include height, materials, colors, windows, porches, and roofing style. Additional elements can be added to the code, but can often cause more costs to be offloaded to a potential home buyer. This meeting concludes the public engagement portion of the project. Blue Line will be preparing a summary of the public engagement feedback received from the public engagement process and will provide it to the city to help inform the next part of the conversation that we will be having, which is how to design the cottage housing code standards. We will be working on drafting the code and will be ready to present to the public in spring of 2023. Thank you again for listening to this presentation regarding the development of cottage housing in the city of Shoreline. We hope that you have all of your questions answered, but if you don't, please reach out to Elise Kim with the City of Shoreline or Caitlin Hepworth with Blue Line. Again, thank you for listening to this, and if you have any questions, please reach out to the city. Thank you and have a wonderful day.